Special thanks to Philip Raby Specialist Cars for providing the Porsche in this review, of course, and if you are located in the south of the UK or even further afield and are looking in particular for, of course, a Porsche or Porsche-related servicing, then of course you should give them a look. But even if you are interested in something else, more specialised, more collectible, then you may want to check out their current stock, or perhaps even get in contact with them about finding you a vehicle. And of course you can do that via the link right below this video in the description. When Porsche first released the Macan back around 2014, it had a very simple task, and the task was not as obvious as it seems. See, many people would view it as just another occasion to sell yet another variation of an SUV, to cash in on the market of what was popular then and still is now of larger 4x4s, trucks, SUVs, and to essentially just fill in that smaller level of the market that the Cayenne didn't fill. You could make an argument for it, but as soon as you drive one of these cars, you can immediately feel what it's actually all about. Now, for me, I've driven a Cayenne as well, and although I'm yet to review one here in Beards and Cars, the differences are immediately apparent, because it happens to, yes, fill in the smaller SUV category and tick that box perfectly, but the reality is it's a very different approach to an SUV, because the Cayenne is much more traditional. Of course, it was based on the same platform as the Touareg. Of course, one of my favourite cars, my first car was a Touareg, and I still love them to this day. This is based on the Audi Q5 platform, but with a lot of changes underneath as well, new suspension, drivetrain, of course, design, but this is much more of a 911 on steroids, if you will, than the Cayenne is. The Cayenne does not feel anything like a 911. In fact, it doesn't even feel really anything like any other Porsche, as far as I'm concerned. Even something large like a Panamera feels nothing like a Cayenne. The Macan, though, really does keep the vibe of a Porsche. It keeps the fun factor, the performance, the kind of chuckability through corners that you typically would not expect from a larger SUV. And one of the reasons why is, of course, because it's smaller, but also it's a lot lighter than many other larger SUVs like your Range Rovers and Cayennes, but also it has an interesting choice of engine. It feels, in my opinion at least, more like a almost naturally aspirated, which of course would make no sense with the turbo name, but it almost feels like a naturally aspirated, say 4.5 litre V8 most of the time. It's got that effortless torque, that low end grunt, even some of the sound is almost like a V8 in the deeper tones, especially inside the cabin, but then in reality it's actually a 3.6 litre twin turbo V6. It puts out similar kind of numbers even to some 911s, like the Targa or a Carrera. Even the Targa 4S that I spoke about recently has similar horsepower. This one, for example, being a 2016 shape Macan Turbo with, of course, the PDK gearbox, puts out 395 horsepower and actually more torque. 406 foot-pounds, which is 550 newton meters. And for any of you who know me and my preferences in Beards and Cars, you will of course know that I love vehicles that have more torque than power, because as fun as power is when you really put your foot down, it's torque that is that much more accessible and that much more useful in daily life in particular. But even when it comes to performance, that low-end grunt that a, for example, twin turbo engine like this one, or a big naturally aspirated V8 like my own cars might have, it's just so much more instantly accessible. And in the case of this Macan Turbo, for example, that shot, that shove, that punch of torque really does come in low. 1350 RPM, and it spans all the way up to 4,500 for peak torque, so you've got plenty of torque, it comes in nice and low, and it is effortless. The fact, of course, that it's a twin turbo means it's super smooth in its delivery, and even the choice of engine being large-ish, like a 911 kind of size engine, but not so big that it feels maybe too heavy or too big for the car. It's very nicely balanced. It allows the car to, not only in its power delivery, but also in its manners overall, road holding, handling, steering, to feel lighter and smaller than it actually is. Because although it's smaller than a Cayenne, it's still a decently proportioned vehicle. You certainly aren't wanting for space in the front or in the back. It really is the loading room that you'll notice the biggest difference between this and something like a Cayenne, but even then, it's really good. And for those who are going to buy a Macan or are thinking about it, well, clearly you don't have the same kind of space requirements to begin with, otherwise you wouldn't be considering one. Likewise with any smaller SUV. Now, there's really only one gripe, I guess you could say, that I had with the Macan and with my time in it. And as far as gripes go, I think it's one which probably won't even bother the majority of people, but it just stood out to me. And that is that the transmission tunnel in this car is very wide for a vehicle of its size, which means that the foot placement, when you're just resting your foot and cruising down the road, feels a little bit awkward. Now, I don't know if maybe it's because I'm spoiled now that I drive classics and have just tons of space everywhere that I'm noticing something like that more. Maybe other people wouldn't notice it at all, but for me, it was the one thing that I was like, that's interesting. It's strange to me how wide that tunnel is going through the center console, but speaking to the transmission, one of the other key differences between this and even a Cayenne of the time, not even comparing it to an older Cayenne, is that choice of transmission. The fact that this is specifically geared to be more of a performance car, more of a pure Porsche experience, but in a car that just happens to be bigger rather than a pure utility vehicle, as the Cayenne started out as, is that choice of transmission. These generation Cayennes still had 8-speed Tiptronics. This was fitted in all of its forms, in that first iteration at least, with a 7-speed PDK. It's a more performance-oriented gearbox. It's more about the shifting, the fun, the performance, whereas with the Cayenne, it's more about being smooth. That clearly defines, even in that one small thing, the differences between them straight off the bat. And in terms of performance even, one of the things that I love about SUVs as well is how much you can shock people with them, because the performance on these, even something like my own Touareg that I referenced, which by today's standards is not particularly quick, but even that thing with that big diesel V10, it could launch off the line just because of the sheer torque, and these can as well. Sure, it weighs a lot more than a 911, it's a lot physically larger, but because it has the all-wheel drive, because it has nearly 400 horsepower, 400 foot-pounds of torque, this can shift. It really can. The top speed is up around 165 miles an hour, and the 0 to 60 time is about 4.6, 4.8 seconds, depending on where you look and who you ask. And with the launch control system on the Sport Chrono Pack, that is reduced by about another quarter of a second. So in reality, in practice, you're talking easily a 4.4, 4.5 second 0 to 60 time, which for reference is about as quick as the 500 horsepower Range Rover SVR, except from a car that has 100 horsepower less. And of course this weighs a lot less than a Range Rover, but still they're both in the broad spectrum of high performance SUVs, and it gives you some idea of how the performance compares. And considering that I've also reviewed one of those Range Rovers, a car which I absolutely love, the dynamics through corners is really where the Macan sets itself apart. To call this just another SUV or just a small SUV, it really does grossly misrepresent just how fun this car is. This is very much so one of those occasions for me where I love going in and doing a Beards and Cars feature on a vehicle that I don't have much expectation for, because more often than not, it's those cars that end up being the ones that surprise me the most. In fact, on some occasions, they've ended up being my Car of the Year award winners, because they're that much better than you'd ever think. The Macan, I'm not so sure for 2023 if it'll be a Car of the Year vehicle, but I could easily see it being in my top 10, because it really is that good. It's so enjoyable to drive, and for me, the fact that I enjoyed it so much is even more impressive, because going into it, much like the Panamera, I wasn't really interested in the Macan. I don't dislike them, but I kind of just thought what many people would. It's just a smaller 4x4, just cashing in on the trend. It really isn't. Does it happen to do that for Porsche? I'm sure it does. It's great for sales, no doubt. But the fact is, it's not lazy. It is a vehicle which is about the feel, the performance, the aggression, the personality, and it does simply deliver that. More, I would argue, than a Cayenne does. A Cayenne may have more utility, and if you're going to live with it and transport a lot of stuff all the time, then sure, the Cayenne has the advantage, and even off-road I'm sure the Cayenne is probably superior. But if you plan to use it mostly on the road, but you do want something that delivers sports car vibes and has space, legroom, headroom, passenger room in the back, luggage room as well, and a smooth ride, these for example have air suspension as an option, then of course it ticks way more boxes than something like a Cayman, a Boxster, or a 911 can. And maybe you're not a fan of a Panamera. Maybe you don't want to spend that much, considering that these Macans were a lot cheaper than the equivalent Panameras. In fact, these were just above the Cayman on the price rank when they were new. Now, of course, they still make these now. They're in different forms. They actually got smaller engines with more horsepower over time, still turbo aspirated, and the future Macan is due to be fully electric with a similar drivetrain to the Taycan. So that, I think, could be very, very impressive, and I'm looking forward to that. But for now, even this 2016 car, and back in 2016 it was one of the times that they refreshed the vehicle with a few updates. 2019, I believe, if I recall correctly, was another time when they updated them. It really is a good car. Simply put, it just really is. In every way, it's an impressive car. It's the kind of car, much like a Panamera, that has to be driven to be appreciated. For those who do drive one, I think more often than not, you really will enjoy it. In fact, in some ways, as well as feeling like a taller 911, it also has a very hot hatch kind of vibe. And in fact, if you were to lower the suspension, it almost has the proportions of something like a larger hot hatch vehicle, which themselves have become very, very quick in recent years. Stuff like Mercedes A45 AMGs, for example. This has that kind of maneuverability, that kind of nimble, kind of float like a butterfly vibe that a sports car or a hot hatch can have. And to achieve that in a big platform with these big, I believe 21-inch wheels in the case of this one, the taller air suspension, depending on if you spec that or not, and just a larger body of around 2 tons. Well, to handle like that, to handle and steer and perform and have the manners, as well as this does, is a testament to one of the many reasons why I believe Porsche is one of the best forces to be reckoned with in the automotive world. They've always been a brand that I've had a lot of respect for on the surface, but the more of their cars that I drive, the more I love them, especially in the past few decades, because they've just gone from strength to strength, making really impressive cars. And this is definitely one of them. And all in all, even if you're looking for the practicality side as well, the turbo doesn't skimp out on that. The yearly road tax, for example, not that you'd care too much if you can afford a Porsche, but even so, it's about half of what you'd expect for a larger SUV, around £360 instead of £630. The fuel economy can average over 30 to the gallon, even as close to 40 on the motorway. So even in terms of practicality, it's not bad at all. The interior design is lovely, the ride is very smooth, very, very comfortable. The handling, as mentioned, is fantastic. So yeah, I mean, as boring as it may sound, this really is one of those occasions where I can just go down the list ticking all the boxes of just a damn good car. And as boring as that can be sometimes it just is true, with my only single gripe being the one that I mentioned earlier on about that unusually wide transmission tunnel. But overall, if you are on the market for something that is a sports car in personality that happens to be kind of hidden within a utility, practical daily driver frame, much like the Cayenne, but definitely more so than that, definitely like the Panamera, but probably with prettier looks for some people at least, this does slot right into that category. And for those who do decide to go for a Macan, maybe even a non-turbo, but certainly a turbo, I think there's going to be a lot for you to love. Of course, I would love to hear the thoughts of those of you who maybe owned one of these, maybe you still do, perhaps a newer one with the smaller, more powerful engine. Maybe even you own the Performance Pack, which increases the power from 400 to about 440, 430, increases the torque by a similar amount as well. I'm sure that's an absolute hoot to drive also, but ultimately give me your thoughts down below, or maybe if you've never driven one and you're curious about it, have I maybe opened your mind to thinking, oh, perhaps this car might be different to what I expected. It certainly was different to what I was expecting, what minimal expectations, as I mentioned, I did have. And of course, if you do want to check out other thoughts that I've had on not only Porsches, but other vehicles such as the Range Rover SVR that I mentioned, of course you can find all of those here on the channel in the Beards and Cars playlist. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.